if we're calm, relaxed, we're alert and, interested and engaged, and we have a friendliness and a kindness and an opening hearted, loving presence to the world, then, all sorts of things are possible, including our liberation.
You're listening to the Wisdom for Wellbeing podcast, the show that blends science and heart to bring you evidence-based tips and tricks for cultivating a healthy, wealthy, and meaningful life. Now, here's your host, therapist, yogi, and fellow full life balancer, Dr. Caitlin Harkis.
Hi there. Today on Wisdom for Wellbeing, I'm joined by psychologist NeLi Martin. NeLi Martin integrates her psychology training with her Buddhist Dharma mindfulness study and practice, together with yoga teaching and practice and dance practice. Very well-rounded, and in her psychology work, she primarily uses evidence-based acceptance and commitment therapy or training, and functional analytic psychotherapy. Linking all of this together is actually the topic of our conversation today. So specifically, NeLi shares her own journey and how she came to integrate the teachings from things like acceptance and commitment therapy, ACT, with Buddhist practices and yoga. Ultimately, you'll hear that all of this is aimed at supporting healing. As NeLi puts it, I believe we humans have great potential for living a free and vital life. Our values and our pain are poured from the same vessel. Deep connection to our struggle and pain with authentic acceptance and compassion allows a transformation that opens us to this deep joy, happiness, gratitude, and vitality, guided by our values, what we care deeply about. So without further ado, let me introduce you to NeLi herself. NeLi, I just wanted to take this first moment to welcome you to the Wisdom for Wellbeing podcast and to thank you so much for joining us here today.
Oh, thank you, Caitlin.
Just to get things started, would you mind sharing a little bit about yourself? And specifically, I'm interested in hearing a little bit about how, you work as a psychologist, but you also have this really rich background in training as a yoga instructor and, a meditation practitioner. So would you mind sharing just a basic overview of your history and you?
Oh, well, now that I'm old, it feels like that could take a million years. But anyway. So my history, I guess, is that I did psychology training straight out of school before I knew any better, and found myself in child protection and juvenile justice as my first role in Western Queensland, and it was a little shocking to the system, to say the least. But I felt like I had really good teachers, and I felt grounded in my, practice. But nevertheless, I took myself off to live in the UK, where I did more child protection work, working with kids who'd been sexually abused, and so it was quite in-depth work for a young person in their 20s, really. And I probably, looking back, I could say I burnt out. I don't think I would have recognised that at the time, but I had what you might now call compassion fatigue. And, had started my own yoga practice as a way to, just be good in my own life. And, that was back in the 1990s, and there wasn't as much yoga around, but I was in the UK. So it was more, there was more opportunities there to practice. And I was getting more deeply into the practice. And, one of my yoga teachers said, why don't you think about training? And so off I did. I went to train as a yoga teacher. It took 3 years in those days rather than 3 weeks or 3 months. So that's not to decry what's happening now. I think it's really beautiful that there's many yoga trainings around. And
it sounds like what you did was really in depth and gave you a real opportunity to dive into the different layers of a yoga practice, as well as probably integrate it in your own experience in life and what you were working with, that significant trauma you were surrounded by every day, the compassion you were experiencing.
Yes, totally. And, I had many good teachers, and the British Wheel, where I did my training, they were a beautiful umbrella organisation, and certainly my diploma course tutor encouraged, to seek out many other teachers. And so I felt quite given a lot of permission to, explore what was out there in the yoga world, which, was fascinating to me because during the teacher training, particularly the aspects of the mind, it felt like so resonant with my psychology training that had happened years before, 10 years earlier.
That's really interesting. So there was some overlap between the aspects of the mind that you were learning about while you were doing your yoga teacher training and what you'd actually studied formally when you were doing your training as a psychologist.
Yeah, totally. And, but, I decided to just teach yoga. I decided it was all too hard work to try and I guess, in those days, I had this sort of sense that my job as a psychologist was to fix people, which, I don't think that's helpful for people. I don't think that's helpful for practitioners. I don't think that's helpful for the world because, people get into psychological distress because, stuff happens like around them, and the way that, we deal with it internally may lead us to a lot of distress. But I personally, and this is, I guess, an opinion that I have about, what is psychological distress, and that really is informed by the understandings that I have from a Buddhist background, but also from the functional contextualism approach that really is the third wave of psychology. So I'm skipping ahead in my own history, but after being a yoga teacher for some time, I found myself really deeply drawn to meditation practice, and the meditation practices that I encountered in the yoga tradition at that time anyway, and that's just because, the internet didn't exist and, it was hard to find people and what was going on. But I was more drawn to the Buddhist practice because, I found a depth of teacher there that I felt really resonant with, people who had forayed into, the mind, who had done enough practice to be able to speak eloquently about the processes of the mind, and it just made total sense to me. So yeah, my meditation practice ended up much more down the Buddhist path, and particularly the Western Insight practice spoke to me, and the teachers that I met at Gaia House and others connected to that with Jack Cornfield's lineage and Joseph Goldstein. So those teachers who had been in robes or around traditional practices in the 60s and 70s, and then come back to the West to teach the rest of us.
And that's an interesting point. So they come back to the West, so things were presented in a framework that was perhaps accessible as a Western individual. And I guess within that, there are a couple points I'd be really keen on diving into, if that's okay with you.
Sure.
So you mentioned that when you were starting to follow different meditation practices, you were starting to notice some overlap with functional contextualism. And I was just wondering if you would give a bit of an overview of what functional contextualism is for the listeners, as well as you mentioned third wave therapies, which someone who might not come from a psychology background might not be familiar with those terms. So maybe we could just start there.
Yeah, sure. And, it was probably a little bit the other way around, because although in my early psychology training, I would have studied systems theories, i.e. that, that we're not really looking at an individual, we're looking at a system, because we can't really see something operating apart from the environment in which it's in. So because behavior arises in a context, essentially, is what a functional contextualism is, and that behavior has a function within the context of the environment.
So an example might be like within a family, that there might be a certain behavior that someone engages in, and the purpose of that might be to, get a little bit longer with mom and dad before bed. So maybe that's why it's such slow going, getting the book or brushing one's teeth or something like that, that the purpose of the behavior, might not seem superficially obvious, but if we look at it, we can see behavior happens for a reason. Is that?
Yeah. Exactly.
You might have a more elegant example than that, but off the top of my head.
Yeah, that's a really good example, and it's a good example because it shows that the behavior is, it's relationally driven. So, the functional contextualism, the relational frame theory, is the sort of basic science that sits inside of that the contextual behavioral world, and from which ACT, the acceptance and commitment therapy, and FAP, a functional analytic psychotherapy, have grown up as therapies. But the relational frame theory is the sort of basic science underneath that gives the applied work, if you like, the therapeutic work, like a basis from which to go, which, when we look around at the sort of therapies, even the good evidence-based therapies, don't necessarily have that theoretical framework underpinning. They have, they have theories underneath it rather than things that have been shown through the basic sciences.
Okay, so ACT, acceptance and commitment therapy, you mentioned, and FAB, so that's functional analytic psychotherapy. Yeah. So these two therapies are evidence-based, and they sit within a real rich understanding of how we interact in relationships and in the world, that there's context for our behavior, and that these are something called third wave therapies, which means that cognitive behavior therapy, which is something people might be more familiar with, a type of therapy that a lot of practitioners use and for which there's a very strong evidence base, was something that developed a number of years ago. And more recently, these third wave therapies have developed, and they've integrated wisdom from Eastern traditions, if I'm doing history justice here. And you might be able to shed light on this and kind of refine what third wave means for the listeners, and what the richness is that these therapeutic approaches bring, and these like philosophical frameworks, really.
Yeah, and I guess third wave could, like in a general, loose, shorthand way, you could say utilize a mindfulness approach, which means, the capacity to notice, what is occurring, and to have, develop the capacity for witnessing one's own internal world from a stance that's more neutral and even to some extent compassionate. So in ACT, that's the acceptance piece, that like trying to change something that's going on internally from like a stance, like a sort of oppositional stance, is actually going to probably further entrench it. That's an argumentative basis. It isn't the basis from which you might change something. And certainly, like DBT, dialectic behavior therapy, would have the same sort of, there's an acceptance piece in there that is, I guess, the wisdom that's come down from the Eastern traditions. Well, that's what I would see. And, was, I guess, pivotal for me to learn. It was like that if you try to change something without accepting it, embracing it, loving it, then in all likelihood you actually just create further suffering. So from a Buddhist perspective, that would be the suffering is the tanha, or the grasping, the clinging, the craving, but also equally the avoidance or the pushing away, so it has both of those aspects when you're like reaching or grasping on wanting something, or when you're sort of trying to push away something that you don't want. And so that the practice and the learning is to open up the space that's neither of those things. And that would be the space of, what we might consider mindfulness, like the ability to notice something occurring, and often needs a place of compassion to do that. Because if what's occurring is unpleasant or what we don't want, then those and I wouldn't even say their urges, almost the sense of like we have to push away what we don't want, and we have to grasp after what we do want.
So there's these urges to push things away that we don't want and to grasp things that we do want, which often results in the experience of more suffering or a dis-ease in one's experience, because energetically they're trying to, we all at different points in times try and make things different than they are. But this practice of mindfulness is perhaps a step and a skill in learning to be with what is, and to practice acceptance, as you described, in both the context of, psychological therapies that are based on this framework, as well as Buddhism and different insight traditions. Is that
Yeah, that's a pretty good summary. Yes. Yeah, beautiful.
So when you went down this avenue of exploring Buddhism as well and starting to see links in this practice and what we called the third wave therapies, would you be able to explain a little bit about the overlap there? Because I think that's a really interesting area, that whether we go down a framework of, Western sort of psychology, psychotherapy, or Eastern insight, that there's a lot of shared experiences and a rich insight that you bring when you integrate the two.
Yeah, sure. And, I guess I've learned, my psychology training, which I probably reinvigorated sort of 12 years ago after deciding that psychology was a waste of time. I did come back into the fold, so to speak. And I've learned from some very brilliant teachers, and it's hard for me to say how, because those teachers have obviously been influenced by, at least a sort of consciousness raising process of the 60s, if not, directly with, John Kabat-Zinn and mindfulness coming in a more sort of mainstream way. So, to have them as completely separate, is probably never happened really, or hasn't happened for a really long time. So that it is an integration, and people have been cross-reading, and there are a lot of folks like me who are sort of straddling the world of psychology and I guess Buddhist practice, or although I'd hesitate to call myself a Buddhist mainly because of my teachers who might suggest that that it's not necessarily about beliefs, but it's about practice.
And I suppose there's a philosophy there, isn't there? A philosophical framework that might guide one's view in the world and one's interactions or practices, and it can be simply that, maybe?
Yes, possibly. And I guess, when you look at particularly the stories from the Buddhist background, then, he fairly famously doesn't answer the question. He doesn't answer any ontological questions, the existence of the universe or like that. So he basically points to that they're the wrong questions if you want to end suffering. So that it's actually just not an ontological question in terms of worldview, but it does decide how you might approach or look at your life as it's unfolding in front of you. So if you approach your life as a problem to solve, like a maths problem, or if you approach your life as something to behold. So one of my favorite psychology teachers, Kelly Wilson, would say, you have to see that. Is life a maths problem to solve or a sunset to behold? And, as psychologists, we need to ask the same questions about, our clients in front of us. Are they a maths problem to solve or a sunset to behold? Because being somebody's maths problem, whether it's your mother's or your psychologist's maths problem, is not, it's not the best feeling in the world. And so, this is, I think, when we look at how we look in through the medical model and diagnoses, that we may be potentially creating more suffering than there needs to be. But it's I understand we have medical shorthand. We need to be able to communicate with people around, clusters of symptoms or what's going on for people to help us understand. But there can be a way that
person seeking help and seeking guidance, that some of the advice you might give them when you're working with them is even just holding that space of allowing them the experience of being a sunset to behold, and perhaps by embodying that and being so present with someone in their experience and not approaching an individual as a problem to solve, a maths equation, that you're teaching someone ways that they might interact with themselves in a way, our own lives, living our lives as, a beautiful sunset rather than something we need to solve. And I guess in that's something where, a lot of individuals might get stuck. So what would be the framework you might offer for an individual to help them move towards that experience of living their life as a sunset, living their life as something that they can behold, something that they can experience, rather than that struggle of problem solving?
Yeah. I mean, there's some really beautiful teachings from, both, I would say, ACT and BAP and also like Buddhist practice and part of it is to, the first and most important thing is to develop the skill to notice stuff and, to notice like when that suffering might be present, and so that's really a lot of practice around embodiment, because we are inevitably going to be holding a sense of, tension or tightness or, something's going to be going on in the body when we're in the place of suffering. So, to use the body as a bit of a barometer is like a sort of key practice. But also to, because it also gives a platform to notice the mind. So what happens with our minds is, and I before I guess I learned to meditate, it wasn't that I wasn't aware of my mind, but I wasn't aware of my mind from anywhere but inside of my mind.
That's an interesting way of putting it.
Yeah. So, I guess developing the capacity to, bear witness to the generation of thoughts, the generation of feelings, emotions, moods, mind states, that it seems like a sort of a simple thing, but it's like a profound shift in terms of the capacity to notice and, to recognize that when we're essentially in some sort of funk or, you would say in Buddhism, some sort of space of dukkha or suffering or, suffering may even be a too strong word, or just a sense of unsatisfactoriness with life. And that, that becomes with a felt sense, but it often also comes with a mood or a mind state or thoughts about, like, why is it like this? And why I shouldn't be doing that. And so, there'll be a whole pattern of thought. So once you begin to notice and recognize that, then you can get curious and ask some inquiry questions. And, this would be something that I would regularly recommend that came from, I think Jack Cornfield might have been the first one to do it, but Tara Brach and many others have sort of used this. And in ACT, we would use something quite similar, but to just begin to recognize. And once something is recognized, then, then we can go into that sort of slight pause and notice and then sort of ask the questions. The inquiry questions might be something around, am I willing to accept this? Like, or am I in a fight with it? So like you ask that question, not from a place of like, well, I should be accepting it, because if we're not, then that's the thing that we may need to notice. We can always step our awareness back one more step to go, oh, okay, well, this is the thing that's occurring. So the framework would be, notice, recognize, accept, and then to do an inquiry into the body about what the thing is that feels like it's suffering. So, inquiries into the body use like a sort of elemental focus. So through the earth, water, fire, air, and space. So that, that would be to come into the body more like in a refined way, to see what its shape, color, texture, movement, heat, wetness, dryness, all of those sort of aspects to the internal felt sense might be. And then if there's still a sense of like suffering, I guess, then you could do the inquiry question. Tara Brach might say something like does it need some nurturance? Jack Cornfield might say something like, am I still really heavily identified with this? So that's the process of nurturing or non-identification, because often it comes down to this sort of sense of self where we feel like something should be different going on internally.
I think that's a really interesting point to unpack. Sorry, just my microphone went for a second. So I guess, NeLi, just to start from the top, because there was layers that happen there. So the first thing that would be really useful for people is to be able to just notice what's happening for them and be able to notice what's happening as a first step in one's body. So noticing sensation as it may be arising or tension, whatever is showing up in the physical body, and that, both perhaps a yoga practice and a meditation, a mindfulness practice would be useful in developing, cultivating cultivating the skill to be aware. And from this recognition of what is showing up, what is present, then you have this opportunity to move into the practice of acceptance. So being able to accept the experience as it's arising in your body, in your life, in that moment. And then following this acceptance was the next step if there was a need for, nurturance or a further practice to support yourself and whatever may be present in that moment. Is that correct? Have I got that?
Yeah. That's sort of like a process. Jack and Tara would use the acronym of RAIN. So the first one being recognition, the second one being acceptance, the third one being the investigation, and then the end being the nurturance, or Jack would use a non-identification.
Okay, beautiful. So there's actually
and they're always inquiries. Yeah, so they're always inquiries, I guess. So rather than any should, must, ought to, and have to, because that would be not acceptance. And so even though acceptance is there, you still have to approach it as an inquiry, or, could I accept this? And am I willing to, in this moment, make space for this mood, thought, feeling, body sensation?
Yeah. Okay. So thank you so much for giving us the RAIN acronym. I think that's a really useful mnemonic, a way of people remembering these skills in a time where things might be feeling a little bit hectic. And I can put a link to that actually in the show notes, so people might be able to look in and actually take that RAIN messaging away with them. So in regards to that skill set then, NeLi, you mentioned that this might be a similar process to some of the therapeutic approaches that you would work with an individual in the therapeutic context.
Yeah, sure. Yeah, definitely. I guess in therapy, though, there's sort of two of you in this space. So, that in some ways I get the privilege of helping somebody do some of that tracking. So it's not just a meditative, internal process. I'm getting folks to let me know out loud what goes on for them.
Okay, so you could point out if they were perhaps not as connected to the sensations that might be arising in the body, or noticing the emotions as they might be experienced, and help guide their awareness.
Yeah, so I mostly do that with an inquiry, though, what's happening now. It's like, in some ways, it's this sort of standard therapeutic. What are you noticing? What's happening for you? And I might, say some things that I notice about, body language, or, how they appear to me. And I might guess at some things sometimes, or like that. But that's really not because I'm interested in guessing. It's more like I'm trying to help guide their behavior, or guide their awareness. And if if I'm wrong, I'm wrong. I'm not really wed to that, to my interpretation of what's happening for them. I'm more just trying to help them make sense of what's happening, particularly based on if there's been a running away or an avoidance of an internal felt sense. And often when people are using substances or other behavior that might be addictive, then it is often that avoidance of what's going on internally. Okay. And certainly that's a lot of the work that ACT might look at in experiential avoidance as being one of the sources of, suffering, or the sources of the psychological distress, they would say more.
Yeah. So avoiding one's experience can result in distress. And interestingly enough, when we are having an uncomfortable experience, often there is a drive to avoid, not to deal with it, to manage it in some way. So it sounds like on your journey, you mentioned that you were working as a psychologist in a really difficult area, suffering what you might now label as compassion fatigue, that you were every day encountering trauma, and that you actually started a yoga practice as a way of coping with that. And I wonder how this practice of yoga might in some ways be different than other avoidance-based or just other mechanisms people might use to cope with really difficult situations, be it, someone else who may have a similar experience in a stressful workplace or difficult family relationships or just different uncomfortable internal experiences, thoughts, feelings coming up. How could yoga perhaps, or how could other tools help them, support them?
Well, I mean, on some level, you could say if you use yoga as an avoidance strategy, then, you'll turn it into that same suffering wheel that you might if you use, binge eating or alcohol or drugs or whatever, overworking, too much sex, whatever. So it certainly has the capacity to be like misused, if you like. But I guess, and, I've certainly seen it like that, or may have even used it like that myself sometimes. So it's like but in its essence, like, it's basically just not that bad for you. It's not like, it's not so bad as like taking drugs for just for the body, like, because it comes from an underpinning sense of respect for the human body, that the practice the practices in and of themselves are designed to take care of the body. That doesn't mean that everybody practices yoga is taking care of their bodies, and you can certainly, overextend yourself in your yoga practice and hurt yourself, and by not taking care. But usually there's enough wisdom around in yoga to help to point those things out, to because it's inherent in the practice to notice, like, when are you striving, when are you end gaming, when are you pushing. Although I don't really experience it firsthand, but I hear that sometimes yoga has moved into that, like, pushing type of activity, pushing people into postures, pushing people beyond their limits, pushing people into like too hot a space or something like that. But inherently there's a respect for the human body, so it wouldn't have that type of effect.
It's an interesting point to being mindful of the practices we're engaging in. So if someone, let's say, turned to yoga as a way of managing some distress they were experiencing, like you did as a young person, it could be the case that perhaps this would be an avoidance strategy, but it may also be the case that in this practice, if it's in an environment that is sharing this wisdom about tuning in and checking in and responding accordingly to the body's needs in a moment, I wonder if that would counter some of the avoidance or transform the avoidance into this experience of interoception, which is just to say, noticing what's happening in one's physical body, and then perhaps being able to use that information to interact differently off the mat, to take that wisdom into one's life. So something that might have been an avoidance strategy could possibly, with that increased skill set, be a tool towards acceptance or noticing.
Totally. And skilled teachers will be doing that, subtly all the time. And that, most people who come to yoga, myself included, for the first time would have been either, wanting something, like grasping after, the good feelings that you get from yoga, or trying to avoid, something, bad feelings or bad body sensations. And, mine was probably the latter, where I was like, my body in pain or in just feeling not so great. But, I equally know yoga teachers and people who in the yoga world who got into yoga because it gave them such good sensations, because they, achieved the jhanic states fairly easily, and then they got into the sort of grasping, which, ultimately didn't lead them down a path. But because of the wisdom that's inside of yoga, there is a pointing out of those things at some point in time, probably early on, but it's just that most of us don't hear that early on. Like, I heard all sorts of things about yoga being non-competitive in my early days, but I didn't necessarily, all that did initially for me anyway was drive that competition internal. So I just didn't speak about it. But then, at a certain point in time, it's like the penny drops and I go, and it's like, oh, that means not competing with myself, or not even competing with myself as I was yesterday, or what I think I will be tomorrow, let alone the person beside me on the mat. And not speaking about it. It's actually dropping the stance of competition. And if I'm not being competitive with myself or anybody else in time or space, then what am I doing? So then, like by definition, it will open up an inquiry practice, but that may not be, or maybe, well, it was true for me. I wasn't able to hear that message early on.
And that's interesting how it relates back to what you described around, beholding a sunset versus solving a maths problem. In the solving a maths problem method of approaching our life in the world, I wonder if that's, must do X posture for, Y result, or must do the posture better than, Joe beside me and Jane ahead of me, or better than I did yesterday, versus noticing what the experience is like in this moment. That sunset analogy, noticing what is arising for you in the practice and responding accordingly in that moment, rather than being focused somewhere else or on achieving or pushing something away.
Yeah, totally. Yes. Yes, I think that wisdom is totally available in a practice, and we have to be available to hear it.
Yeah. And so NeLi, I know that you do some yoga practices for anxiety and depression. So fusing these two areas where you have expertise and knowledge. And I wonder if we might be able to start to finish our conversation, perhaps just sharing a little bit about what's different about how you integrate your wisdom in that forum.
Yeah. Okay. So, I think yoga, I think of those things. So there's the mindfulness approach, which is, the acceptance and the opening up and allowing of all things that are occurring in phenomena to be there. And, and we can affect change, and it is actually beneficial to cultivate the beneficial mind states, if you like. So if we're calm, relaxed, we're alert and, interested and engaged, and we have a friendliness and a kindness and an opening hearted, loving presence to the world, then, all sorts of things are possible, including our liberation. So it is still useful to, cultivate the mind states that can help us on our path, and, and to find ways to shift the ones that aren't beneficial and don't cultivate. But of course, what we just spoke about earlier was that if we just try to push them away, we often can't do that. So however you approach a practice where you might be shifting something that, you want to take some time. And that's why I think often a yoga practice and a meditation practice will have an entry process, if you like, where there's an ability to look at the intention and the motivation, and to give a bit of space and clarity to the approach, I guess. So we get an opportunity to look at, am I just am I rolling out my yoga mat to go, oh, I've got to get rid of this pain in my shoulder, which, I've had a shoulder injury, so I need to be mindful of my, where's my results? Where's my, deliver the goods for me yoga practice? So that's why slow entry. So a sort of an opening practice and a setting of an intention, a prayer, an offering, where that that push or that pull gets to be seen, and so that at least there's an acknowledgement of that, and maybe the intention is to allow that to to drop away or to open up a space, or so I think the intention setting is really important.
Okay.
And then there basically is technology inside of yoga to shift moods and mind states, and it's not really rocket science. On some level a lot of the work is with the breath, and if you want to calm the nervous system, you encourage the breath out, and there's lots of practices that help to let go of the breath, to encourage the breath out, so that this the nervous system gets to drop. And there's ways that we can work with the body to do nervous system. I guess I think of them as nervous system resets, like, to shake and to use sound and, use the movement, use like precise movements to help, the vagus nerve to soften, to like let go. And, we have to know that all of those practices are only like, we can set them up and get curious and interested about the results. Like, we become our own internal lab, and we want to not, like, we can't in fact force the results, because if we try to force the results, that's usually when the results don't happen. But, we do the practice and open up the inquiry space. It was like, oh, well, let's see what happened from that. So, it's like slow in, and it's also slow out, which means sort of like you want to leave a space to notice the effects of the practice and open up that as an inquiry space. So, okay, so what happened when we did that? And let's be as curious and open as we can to the noticing aspect, not like, damn it, that didn't work, or yes, I feel better. And so, and obviously when you're working with depression, then the same sort of thing. There's, the way to encourage the breath in and move the body so that it opens up more, so that it is like inspired. So there's inspiration from the breath, and then, the more oxygen we have circulating through the system, the more bright we feel. And, again, the movements of the body and the movements of the eyes and, certain things in the body will brighten the mood and will lift the energy. And again, slow in, look at our intention. If we're like, God, I just have to feel better. If we're going into the practice like that, we're less likely to have the results with like, okay, let's just see what the technology does and make the space at the end to, do the observations and inquire, I guess. Yeah.
So it's really beautiful. It's this opportunity to set an intention for a practice, to have space at the beginning and to connect with where your heart might be guiding you in showing up on the mat for this yoga practice, and then having space at the end to reflect on what unfolded, what that experience was like, and having the practice itself be very guided by science and understanding of how different distress affects the body. So you mentioned the vagus nerve, which is this giant nerve in our body that is connected to our parasympathetic nervous system, which is so clearly associated with different distressing experiences, as well as different conditions in the body, like inflammatory conditions, which of course then have this overlap with, anxiety and depression themselves. So the fact that the yoga practice can be designed to work on the vagus nerve, you mentioned different types of breath control, using breath as a mechanism and experience in the practice, and different experiences with the eyes as well. So it sounds to me like when you're offering this gift, this practice, it's really guided by the wisdom of a therapeutic practice in the noticing, observing, reflecting, the wisdom of the yoga movement, and also the science that underpins both of them in regards to what is actually happening in our system physiologically when we're anxious, when we're depressed, and how can we positively utilize these skills for one's mood benefit and one's relaxing benefit, I suppose. Is that an okay overview?
Yeah, that's perfect. Yeah.
So then in regards to where people might go from here, what would you say would be really useful steps in someone's healing journey going forward? If they were going to take a couple of points from today, would there be any recommendations that you would have to follow up, or just to start going down this beautiful path that you've been treading?
Yeah, I mean, I'm so in love with like yoga and meditation and dance, and I feel like the body is where it's at these days. I know that in the last sort of 4 or 5 years, I've heard the word embodiment used so much and so regularly, and I feel like mindfulness of body, and yoga practices all bring us like home to the body, and the more time we have, with ourselves in front of a flat screen like you and I are right now, the more that we sort of need that, because we already had well, most of the reason when I felt I had a really, before there was, the age of the screen, I had a strong propensity to be in my head anyway, like thinking about everything. And, the relationship with my body was, before yoga, really just one of, see what it can do for me, and, can it play sport good enough to win the competition, or does it look okay, or whatever. But this, the sense of just coming home to the body, like we've called it interoception in psychology, like coming home to the felt sense of the body. I feel like we need it now more than ever, like because of we have so much screen time, and the preference that is in the world. Everything is like the age of technology and thinking, and we get so much more reward for that. So my sense is like, come home to the body, really, and come home to like ourselves and each other, and whatever works for you, like yoga, meditation, dance, those three things really work for me to come home to the body. But if you come home to the body, I live at the beach at Noosa, which is very lucky, and so I know a number of my friends would say it's surfing for them. Yeah. And I love getting in the water too, but I've stood up for 4 seconds, but so I'm not there with surfing yet.
You've got your other practices to find your connection to yourself.
Yeah.
And that it's unique, it's individual, exactly. So people can maybe start exploring, and if they haven't found an area where they enter this zone where they feel connected to themselves, that yoga and meditation might be a really beautiful avenue to pursue, to start, to give a go to, because that might offer them the opportunity to notice what is going on in their body, to check in with their self, and to experience, life as a sunset unfolding.
Totally. And, and our bodies are like our minds must be too, but it's like through the felt sense of the body, we can connect with the natural world. And, and for me, that's also really a key part of, healing and presencing, like when we're noticing the energetics of not only like what's inside our own skin bag, but what's outside of our skin bag, like what, and that we feel that like interconnectedness and the indivisibility between, us all and, the world around us. So my sense is that the pathway is through the body.
That's really beautiful. And that's a really beautiful note to finish off on too, this interconnectedness. And I think that, relates to a real driving force. We talked about relationship earlier and how important that is, and the fact that we are in relationship, and perhaps in one way or another, we are all in relationship in this together, that there is this interconnectedness that we can experience in different practices and different moments in our lives, and that can be really nourishing. Yeah, so NeLi, I know that you do some amazing work, and you do actually offer those three elements, yoga, meditation, and dance in different forums, doing workshops and retreats, as well as offering one-on-one therapy at your practice in Noosa. So we're recording this episode a little bit early, so as we discussed, I will finish off with some updated notes on where individuals might be able to access upcoming retreats and workshops. But in regards to where they can find you online, they can go to mindfulness-practice.com or nelimartin.com. And I'll also have those links in the show notes so people can check in and get in contact with you and connect in with the offerings that you are so generously and beautifully serving up. So thank you very much, NeLi.
Oh, thank you, Caitlin. It's been such a pleasure to have this conversation. Thank you.
Yeah, absolutely. My pleasure as well. And I'm looking forward to talking with you soon. I hope that you found this interview with NeLi as interesting as I did. She's clearly a brilliant mind, and her capacity to link together acceptance and commitment therapy, functional analytic psychotherapy, Buddhist practices, yoga, and dance was really eye-opening to me. Now, you can find more about NeLi's work generally on her website, NeLi, NeLi Martin.com. Or if you're interested in her private practice based in Noosa, Queensland, Australia, check out mindfulness-practice.com. Of course, all of this, including the acronym for RAIN and the other things we mentioned in the episode today, can be found in the show notes at drcaitlin.com, along with a full episode transcript. Thank you very much, and we'll see you back here next Wellbeing Wednesday. All right, bye for now.
Thanks for joining us this week on the Wisdom for Wellbeing podcast. Please visit drcaitlin.com to connect, find show notes, other episodes, and to subscribe. While you're at it, if you find value in this show, we'd appreciate a rating, or perhaps simply tell a friend about the show. Wisdom for Wellbeing is not a substitute for professional, individualized mental health treatment. If you are in crisis, please contact 000, your local emergency number if you are outside of Australia, or attend your local hospital ED.